came to a man, and his name was Gideon. And we pick up the story here in Judges, the 6th chapter. We don't even know the prophet's name, but he brought a warning message to the nation there and to the people there. I want to read a little bit of this today because it's such a really inspiring story, and I think it has a lot to do with our society today and where we are now, and maybe even in your own personal life. I think there's great lessons in this. In Judges, the 6th chapter, of course, this book of Judges was a time when there was no king in Israel, and they had to have someone that would arise every once in a while and just sort of take charge of the catastrophe Israel was making of themselves. They would go away from God. They would disregard his laws, his commandments, his holy days. They would start worshiping pagan gods, and God would plague them, and he would bring all sorts of bad things upon them. And somewhere along the way, some person would stand up and say, somebody's got to get a hold of this. And they would stand up and become what was called the judge, as they classify them. And they would sort of take control, and they would turn to God, and God would hear their prayers, and he would rescue them, and he would bless them, only so that a few years later, maybe 15, 20, 30 years later, people began to wane, their spirit, their dedication to God would begin to wane, and they would find themselves back in the same place again. And that's why you have so many judges listed in this book, because it happened time and time again. And it says, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them in the hand of Midian 7 years. It's interesting to me that this aspect of God's character, he delivered them purposely into the hands of the Midians. And if you look at the history of the Midianites, they were descendants of the union between Abraham and Keturah, who was his, the concubine, if you will. And she was remember, she was sent away because Isaac was going to be the uncontested heir of Abraham. And so this people began to grow, and they began to, through this history of time that has passed, they became a people, and quite a few descendants of their history down through history. They became quite a descendant, but also they were almost always advocates, adversaries, I should say, of Israel. And a couple of examples of that is, you remember Joseph, in Joseph's day, his brothers sold him to the Midianites, because they were traveling sales. They were a band of traveling caravans of people that dealt with trade. On another occasion, Moses fled to the land of Midian, remember, when he was fleeing Egypt, and he actually married a princess there, and who became his wife, and he had children. And then the Midianites were also in league with the Moabites and the Amorites when the Israelites were trying to get into the promised land. They were standing in the way and wouldn't let them pass. You remember, they resisted them. And so they have had a long history of being adversaries of Israel, and it wasn't any different on this occasion. But look what it says. God delivered them in his hand, and the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens which were in the mountains and caves and strongholds. So they had to move up into the hill country and in the mountains and the caves, because they couldn't even dwell out in the land where the farming was easy. And so it was when Israel was sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, who were their partners, and the children of the east, even they came up against them. And of course the Amalekites were descendants from Esau, and they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth till thou come into Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor oxen nor ass. So they gobbled up all the resources, all the animals and the crops. Look what it says in verse 5. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers. Now, I've used this term before in a sermon, where if you want to describe immigration or illegal immigrants coming into our country as grasshoppers, and I've probably been ridiculed about using that term. That's a biblical example here of these outsiders who just flooded into Israel and multiply, for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. They weren't there to bring about bounty, bring about growth, or contribute to the society. I was looking, they say that 13, or no, excuse me, I think the number is 11 million. They say 11 million illegal immigrants have come into our country since the Biden administration has been in power. Some of the others say that it's upwards of 16 million. I was doing some math this morning because I was curious. I thought, that's 16 million people, but that doesn't include the children that they've had since they've been here. And you know that the growth rate is down in the United States? Did you know that? I may have told you that. The growth rate is supposed to be about 1.2 to 1.3 per capita in the United States, and we're down to 0.5%, between 0.5 and 1.2. So countries know, people that deal with populations realize France is also the same, that if you don't do something about that, you could cease to be a nation of this group of people. It's happened in the past. Another interesting thing to me is they're not teaching cursive writing to children anymore. That blows my mind. The Constitution was written in cursive writing. Are people getting to the point where they won't even be able to read our own Constitution and Declaration of Independence? We're coming to a place where we've never been before. I mean, they taught that since the beginning of our nation. And now all of a sudden in the digital age, I understand there's some benefits to having a digital age, but you can't even sign your name unless you put an X, I guess, or maybe a digital keystroke. That's my signature. Anyway, the population growth, there is a formula for population growth. And it gets really complicated because it has to do with the fertility rate of certain cultures. But it's basically the number of population you have now versus time. And I just picked this morning, the population growth of the United States, which is 0.5, and then I realized that's not right because this is a different culture. So I went and looked at the Hispanic growth rate, and theirs, guess what, is like 1.5. No, theirs was over 2%, I think it was. I have to look it up. Maybe I wrote it down here. I can't remember now. But either way, their population growth was like 3 times. It was like 1.5%, I think it was. It was 3 times that of the United States, people in the United States. So what happens to these 16 million people in 20 years? They become almost 20 million people. I mean, you can see, and it has to do with the birth rate versus the death rate and the growth of that. But this population is not only going to be here, they're going to continue to grow and multiply. And I only say that because not that I have anything against those people. It was 40 years ago, the first time that I ever worked with an illegal immigrant. And I remember almost the day of the week, I saw this guy standing over there, couldn't speak a word of English. And I grew to become very good friends with these guys. Most of them couldn't speak English, so I had to learn Spanish so I could tell them what to do. But over time, over this 40 years, that population or that culture has taken every single labor job that I can list to you, whether it be the oil field, the highway department, the boring, like you have these boring machines where they're laying poly pipe to run cable. You look at those, you drive down and you see who's got all of those labor jobs, and all the tire shops, every one of them now. I mean, not every one of them. Of course, I'm painting with a broad brush here. But obviously, the labor force has been invaded by, maybe that's a harsh word, has been taken by immigrants that are willing to come here and do those jobs. Who was it? Bush said that. They're coming to take jobs Americans won't do. I don't agree with that because I worked in a lot of labor jobs when I was a young man. It was the only thing I could do, to make money and a young family, and I had to pay the bills, But anyway, what happened here, they entered the land and destroyed, and there was a multitude of them, and Israel was greatly impoverished. We have been talking about this in the Church of God, and political leaders have too, about the situation we're going to find ourselves. Now, you're a racist. You can't be talking about illegal immigrants coming into this country and taking your job, or what's going to happen. Look what happened here in history. They became impoverished. They also were up in the mountains hiding because of the number of them. because the Midianites and the children of Israel, and it caused the Israelites to cry out unto the Lord. The same old story as I said. You get in trouble, you're in a well, you're hanging by your ankle in a 60-foot well, like my biology, or I think it was my biology teacher told me that. He said, you want to see what dark is? You get a box, you paint it black, on the inside and out, you drill a hole in it, go down a 90-foot well and look in that hole, and that's black. That was just a joke, sorry. Anyway, you're hanging by your ankles in a 60-foot well, and all of a sudden there's a God. God, please help me, save me. When you get in difficult situations, it seems the only time that many people cry out to God. I want to make this statement too, and because I was thinking about this morning. There are a lot of good people in our nation. A lot of good people in our nation. Good-hearted people in our nation. You know, we could stand up here for the next 20 years and complain and talk about how bad the world is and how insane the world is and how the world's gone crazy and how the world is all the evils and all the crime. But we need to also offset that by the fact that there are a lot of people in this world that don't have that sentiment, that want to destroy our nation. Judy and I were kind of discussing this on the way over here. There are people who have a vast amount of power and almost unlimited amount of money that do want to shred the Constitution of the United States and destroy our country. You know, it's been said, we were discussing how, they say that all Democrats want to destroy our country. I think that's too broad of a statement to say that. I think there are Democrats that love our country that, for some reason or another, they, maybe because of their parents and their grandparents were Democrats. There's Republicans, I think, that want to do damage to our country. I'm not saying that either party has it perfect. I'm just saying there are more good people than you think they are. There are people out in the country, out of these big cities, and I think a vast majority of our country are good-hearted people, will do things for you, that love our country, that are patriotic. Did you see Madison Square Garden? New York packed the house with Trump there. That was awesome to see. That shows me that there are people that love our country. And he didn't pay them to show up there. I was really impressed with that. I thought it was fantastic. He's not bussing people in. They came because they love our country and they're patriotic for it. And Israel was greatly impoverished. I read that. And the Lord sent a prophet. This is a prophet. We don't know who he is. To the children of Israel, said unto them, thus says the Lord God of Israel. Every time the prophet comes, they say this. He doesn't say, this is what I say. Or guess what? You need to do what I tell you to do. He just comes along, humbly doesn't even tell us his name, and says, thus says the Lord God. I brought you from out of Egypt, and I brought you forth out of the house of bondage. I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of that oppressed you, and drove them out from before you, and gave you their land. Sound familiar? Does it sound familiar? And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God. Fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. Is that prevalent today? I love the United States. I love my country. I was looking this morning at the seal of the United States because I went and voted. And on that little sticker they give you, I didn't put mine on. I kept it because I wanted to preserve it for some reason. On it is the seal of the United States. And on that seal is an eagle. And that eagle has a breastplate that has 13 stripes on it. And in his talons, he has an olive branch that has 13 leaves. And in the other talon, he has 13 arrows. And out from over his head are these stars, which are 13, that proceed up to 13 clouds. And they call it the glory over the eagle. I think all of those things have significant meaning to our country. I think far more than the people believe. Now, you go read what it says about that. This is because of the 13 colonies, they'll tell you. I think it has a lot deeper significance. I think those stars that are over the eagle's head are not just stars that are up in those clouds that are 13. You read the book of Revelation, see what it says about stars and about the churches. and about what's over those churches. I think the people that drew that up knew exactly what they were doing. So I love my country, and I don't want to see anything bad happen to our country. I hope that we don't. I hope that in our infidelity, which was happening here to the Israelites, that we don't lose sight of God, because he's the only one that can save us. He's the only one that can rescue us. And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak tree. Now, Gideon didn't know this was an angel. He just saw a man, probably a traveler. You know, they told me this week, I think last week, maybe it was during the feast. I was watching this scientist. He said, we used to say there are billions of galaxies. He said, we can't say that because now there are trillions and trillions of galaxies out there. That blows my mind. Judy tried to have a conversation. She said, I can't. No, my mind just won't go there. I'm sorry. I said, well, you got to think of it as, try to make a comparison. She's like, you just can't. You can't, and neither can I. Trillions of galaxies. So this traveler came from out there, I don't know how many miles, how many light years away, to stand here and talk to Gideon. And he said, he came by this oak in Ophrah and pertained to Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress to hide from the Midianites. So he's threshing grain and trying to do it secretly. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, the Lord is with thee, you mighty man of valor. You talking to me? Are you talking to me? Those movies, those are in a movie. You talking to me? I think Robert De Niro said that. Not that I particularly like his leanings, but anyway. Here's Gideon, obviously poor, obviously disheveled, probably in clothes he's been wearing for 7 years. I mean, you think about his situation, hiding to try to thresh a little grain so he can take it back home and feed his family, I guess. And here comes this traveler and says, you're a mighty man of valor. So I say to you, God looks at you that way. Even though we may be going through troublous times, difficult times, even though we may be under God's plan to make us suffer, he is trying to do something with you, and he was trying to do that with Israel. He's trying to bring them back to him. But I say that he looks at each of you and he says the same thing, that you are marvelous in his eyes. You are something incredibly special. And he says, and Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all of this befallen? Why all the bad stuff? And by the way, where's all the miracles? How many times have you heard that? I've heard it my whole life. Where's all the miracles that they had back in the old days? What happened to that? Why don't we have somebody that can perform miracles? Which our fathers told us, saying, did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us. So as proof, he's saying that because you don't have any miracles, God has forsaken you and delivered us in the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, go in your might, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent you? And so he said unto him, O Lord, wherewithal shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor, as I said, and as in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, surely I will be with you. And so he went about this little test here. He went and he said, don't leave. I'm going to prepare a meal for you. I don't want you to leave without me offering some food. So he made this little meal for him. And down in verse 19, it tells us he made the unleavened bread of cakes in the basket and the broth in a pot. And the angel of the Lord said in verse 20, take the flesh and lay the unleavened cakes and lay them on the rock and pour the broth upon them. And he did. And the angel of the Lord sent forth his staff, which was in his hand, and he touched the flesh and unleavened cakes. And there rose up a fire out of the rock and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Now that would be pretty impressive. You're laying it there on a bare rock. There's no fire. You just lay it out there. I guess he's going to sit down here and eat. He touches it with his staff. Poof, a fire erupts and just burns it all up. And there's smoke and, ashes. And the angel disappeared out of his sight. And that's when Gideon perceived that he had seen an angel. And Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, For behold, I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. We know that this was an angel because it says no man has seen God at any time or seen his face. You know, in the book, I think it's in the book of Hebrews, it says, be careful when you enter, always be careful to entertain strangers, because some have entertained angels unawares. You need to, not only do you love, I think this point was made during the feast, not only do you need to love God, you need to love your fellow man. Jesus taught that. You know, he said that's part of the 2 commandments that he gives us, to love God and love your fellow man. So if you never love other people, there may be an opportunity where an angel is there to see whether you're going to love other people or not. I mean, it may be a test. It may have been for Gideon here. I don't know. And Gideon built an altar there. I'm going to skip down here for lack of time. And he built the altar up on the Lord, verse 26, up on the top of the rock in order to place the second bullock and offer the burnt offering, the wood, and the grove. And, I skipped the part where he says, take your father's young bullock in verse 25, even the second bullock of the 7th year, and throw down the altars of Baal that your father hath cut, that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. Now this is his dad. His dad had built all these pagan altars to Baal. I wanted to mention here just a little bit about Baal. I'm going to look back here in my Bible. I think I've got some notes here in this. Baal was the chief deity of the ancient Canaanites. His exploits and licentious worship practice were well documented in the literature of the ancient Ugarit. The son of El, which was their word for God, by the way, Baal was both a heroic figure as a storm god and a fertility deity. Listen if you recognize any of these names. Who was worshipped in many cult centers under various forms and emphasis. Hence, Balaam, or plural for Baal, Ashtaroth, you've heard that name mentioned in 1 Kings, known also in literature of Agarit and the Phoenicians as the god of erotic love and war. She was known elsewhere in ancient Near East as Ishtar and Astarte. Where do we get the word Easter from? Right here. The god of love, the god of, sex, the god of, war, if you will. The veneration of the goddess in the ancient entered in the Mediterranean world under the name Astarte. That's another one there. And the practices associated with her cult became associated with the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. There's another one you would recognize. She was, I'll skip that. I want to get down here. The rites that accompanied such activities was frenzied dances, cult prostitution, and at times even human sacrifice. And of course, we know that happened to Israel. It's hard to believe that the ancient Israelites actually got to the point where they conducted, as a religious rite, human sacrifice, their own children, throwing them on the pyre to Baal, their pagan god. Unbelievable. That's what brought about God's correction and God's adjustment or his judgment upon them. Let's see. I want to skip down here. Down to verse 34, but the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet. So God told Gideon, you go tear down these idols of Baal. I wrote here in my notes that there were several occasions where God did this, and I may have trouble finding them in my notes because I've skipped all the way down here. But you remember Josiah when it said he tore down the houses of the Sodomites. On another occasion, it was Hezekiah. And, every time one of these men would turn to God, they would destroy these pagan idols and idols of worship. It was in Jeroboam's day. You remember when the prophet came to Jeroboam and he said, he said, behold, you're going to see the day when the altar is rent and it's going to be tumped over. And, Jeroboam pointed a hand at him and said, seize that guy. And his hand turned to a stick. Remember that? The point I'm trying to make is when you begin to attack religious observances of pagans, you better be careful. Mr. Armstrong used to say this. Bashing idols is not a very safe job when you begin to take down other people. Jesus, in his day, when he was addressing the people in charge of his day of the temple and telling them, you're a bunch of hypocrites. Got him killed. It got him killed, didn't it? Eventually, they wanted to kill him the first day he called them that, because they were in charge and they were the ones that made the rules. And I think we might even see a little bit of that in our nation today. This idea of deciding that we're right and no one else can question it. And that's what he was dealing with here. Anyway, down to chapter 7, we'll get on here to verse 2. It says, and the Lord said to Gideon, your people are too many to give you into the hands of the Midianites. God had, I guess he had come to the rescue when he always comes to the rescue, it seems like, when we're at our lowest estate, maybe. You know, I think he does it because he wants to see how far we'll go. How far will your faith go before you give up? Because he's not giving up. He says, I'm not going to give up. Think about what he did to Abraham when he told him to sacrifice Isaac. I mean, he went to the very point of drawing the knife, and then he heard the angel. I bet you that was the hugest relief in his whole life, of knowing that he didn't have to go through that test. An enormous, huge test. Happened many times in the Bible with the nation of Israel. Look at the nation of Israel on the night of Passover. People are dying everywhere, and God waits till the last second to march 1.5 million people out of Egypt. And they walked out of there, and they were probably dumbfounded that they were walking out of that land that they had been in prison for over 400 years. They never saw it coming. They never saw it coming. And so he's telling them, your nation, the army you've assembled here is too big. I guess they had, 35,000, or 30, I guess. I can't remember now. I wrote it down here. But he says, now go and the people, those that are fearful, and let them return. So 10,000 returned, and there were only 22,000. And there returned to the people 22,000, there remained 10. So there were 32,000 people. And so 22,000 walked away. They were afraid. And the Lord said to Gideon, there's still too many, and bring them down to the water, and I will try them. And so he does this little exercise. Those that get down and lap like a dog, or those that kneel down and they're sort of cunning and they're crafty and they're looking around, and those, he sent them home. The ones that didn't care, they just flopped down, belly flop, and licking up water like a dog. They're not watching the horizon and see who's going to attack them. They're the worst of the soldiers. And that is who he chose. Those 300 men, warriors, if you want to call them. You know what? I think they were the ones in the very back of the ranks. You know, all the mighty men and the noble men and the strong men and the people that had ability and war and swords and everything. I don't think they were included. You know why? Because God was not going to let them win this battle and take credit for themselves. He wanted them to know that he was the one that was delivering them. And so he's going to use the worst odds, and he's going to deliver them anyway. And the number of them that lapped put their hands were 300. And the Lord said to Gideon, by 300 men that lapped, I will save you. Down in verse 7. And so the people took victuals in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent the rest of Israel into their tent. Y'all go home. What? We're going home. And there remained 300 men. And it came to pass that night that the Lord said unto him, arise and get thee down to the host. So Gideon was allowed to go down to the edge of the camp of the enemy, and he heard one of them say, the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east, verse 12, lay along the valley like grasshoppers for a multitude. We'll find out later there were 135,000 of them. 300 against 135,000. I think it's 450 to odds, 450 to 1 odds. And their camels were without number in the sand of the seaside for multitude. And Gideon was come, and behold, there was a man that told him a dream. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came into the tent, and smote it, and it fell, and it overturned it. And all his buddies said, that means Israel is going to come in and destroy us. And of course, you know the story. And it was so that Gideon heard the dream and interpretation that he was obviously motivated then to go through with what God told him to do. And he divided the company into three, and he said unto them, verse 17, look on me and do likewise, and behold, I am come out of the side of the camp, do as I do, and when you blow the trumpet, I and all that are with you will blow the trumpet also on every side of the camp, the sword of the Lord, and say the sword of the Lord of Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came to the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle of the watch, and they had but newly set the watch. They blew the trumpet and break the pitchers. They had these big clay pots or pitchers with a lamp or some sort of a torch inside of it. And so they surrounded the nation of Midian, and they blew these trumpets, broke these vases, and all of a sudden there's light shining in every direction, and there's this sound of alarm. So it was in the middle of the quiet of the night when these Midianites were asleep. While they were rolled up in their beds, a blast of the trumpet startled them out of their sleep. Half dressed, they stumbled out of their tents, probably half hung over, maybe. They were having a drinking party, who knows, only to see the surrounding torches of the enemy. And it tells us here in verse 22, and the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man his sword against his fellow. So they began to just slashing swords and spears and whatever, and they killed one another. And I think there was only like 15,000 of them left that fled. And of course, Gideon and his armies and some of the other tribes kicked in and mopped up the rest of these foes that were out here. You know, I guess if you apply this to your own life, you know, I was reading something the other day that we tend to be creatures of habit. And I admit. But we also surround ourselves with comforts, and we put ourselves sort of in a protective bubble. And we don't want to get outside that bubble. But to grow, you know what the first line of defense against progressing or becoming better or maturing or advancing your life is? You know what the first line of defense is? Fear. When you're afraid, you won't try anything new. You won't go out of your house. You won't go out of your city limits or your county or your state. I know people who've never been out of their own county. It blows my mind. I think you have missed a vast, beautiful country with all of its beautiful sights that you can see. I guess you can sit home and look at it on the internet, but I can tell you what, the internet will never tell you what the Grand Canyon looks like. I don't care how many pictures they post. Standing there looking off into that vast Grand Canyon will take your breath away. So will Panama City Beach, though. It does to me every year. I go down there. My dad one time said, why do you go down there? You just stand there and look at the ocean? I said, yeah. And I never get tired of it. I thought this year, well, maybe this year after, I think Judy and I said we've been down there, I don't even know now, 18 times, 20 times. And I locked out on that balcony, and it did it to me again. I just awestruck at the beauty of that sight. It just took my breath away again. Anyway, so if you wish, out of this story here, to gather some principles from it, if you wish to overcome the adversarial situation you find yourself in, maybe you're suppressed, maybe it's money problems, maybe it's health problems, maybe, I don't know what is going on in your life. I know what's going on in mine. There's problems all the time. But the first thing that God did was what? To put down the temples of Baal and take that out of their society. Josiah did that. And he transformed the nation. It's called the Reformation of Josiah. When he did it, Hezekiah, other men, and if you look back in history, did that. They brought, and women, I think about Esther and some of those that turned to God in times of deep trouble. And I guess in your own life, if you get rid of the things that stand between you and God, that's a first step. And I know you're afraid. I know you can be afraid to make changes. I read something this week that says, if you don't like the devil in your life, quit enjoying his company. You can't have the devil in your life and God at the same time. You got to get him out. However that is, by prayer, by asking Jesus Christ for strength to command him to depart. The Bible says if you flee him, he will depart from you. He can't stand that you resist him. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So you got to put up the resistance. You got to overcome that fear. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to do something different. But after fear comes these steps towards change that will be so rewarding to you. It will be unbelievable. I promise you that. I want to go to Isaiah the 9th chapter. Just a couple of scriptures here to close with. Isaiah the 9th chapter. I love this scripture. I quoted it, I think, during the feast. Nevertheless, Isaiah the 9th chapter, verse 1, nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterwards did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan in Galilee, speaking here of Jesus Christ's ministry of the nations. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. Israel, I guess, saw a great light at this point. Not only did they see the prophet, they saw an angel, and then Gideon, and then the words of the Lord that were coming to Gideon. They've seen a great light. They that dwell in the shadow of death, upon them the light has shined. I usually skip these verses right here because I'm talking about Jesus Christ, but look what it says. You have multiplied the nations and not increased their joy. They joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For thou hast broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. Talking about Jesus Christ, what he can do for each of us when he can break this yoke, this bondage that we may find ourselves under. For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Hebrews, the 11th chapter here, and we'll close here. Hebrews 11. This is, of course, the faith chapter. It talks about all the women of faith, Abel, Enoch. Down in verse 6, it says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. It talks about Noah. Look what Noah had to go through. You talk about a trial of faith. I mean, he was saved when the whole world was destroyed. That's an amazing event. Abraham, of course, I talked to you about him, and Sarah down in verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. I voted yesterday. I was very happy to vote because I felt like it was my civil duty for my country. I want to try to do what's best for my country in what little way I can, which seems insignificant, but it is my vote. You know, but I also know, no matter what the outcome of the election, my sights are not on next Tuesday. My sights are out there in the future, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 1,000,000 years, and so are yours. We are strangers and pilgrims on this earth. The world does not revolve around what we believe. The world goes on. The world can steamroll over you. The world can make you afraid. But we have an advocate. We have a high priest. We have a king and a God that is coming back. And I want you to see that and know that. Look down in verse 23. He talks about Moses choosing rather, verse 25, to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. You could enjoy life. You could throw God in the trash and go out here and pursue. I was reading an article about John D. Rockefeller, who his whole life he spent gaining money. And he became an oil man, and then he began to buy refineries, and then he bought up all the refineries, and he was the richest, the first, I think, billionaire that there ever was. And at age 50, he started shriveling up and dying. And he couldn't figure out, and he came to the realization, I cannot control my physical body. I can control other people. I can get more money, and I can pile it as high as a barn. But he realized, I can't take a penny of it with me. Guess what he did? He started giving it away. He started a foundation and started helping people. Did you know that he also gave money that brought about some of the vaccinations and things like that helped other people? That once he started giving away the money, he started feeling better. And he started finding value in life. And he realized how good he felt for helping other people instead of trying to get it all the time. I thought that was an amazing story and a revelation. And he gave God the credit for bringing him to that point in his life. And he lived to be like, he was going to die at 50, and yet he lived to be like 92. An amazing story. I want to finish up here. What's the scripture I was trying to read down in verse 32? And what shall I say more? For the time shall fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and also Samuel and of the prophets, who through the faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. You can think of Daniel. Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned the flight of the enemies of the aliens, as we read here. And women received their dead raised again. Jesus raised children to their parents again. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. Think about the Apostle Paul. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world is not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens of the caves, just like we read about the Israelites. And all these, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promises, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should be made perfect. We're all going to get there at the finish line at the same time. That's great news. The story of Gideon's victory is one born out of necessity. It's born out of fear, out of a sense of hopelessness. It is also set in the middle of total domination by enemies, both militarily and economically. The sheer population of the enemy was overwhelming. But as God's story and man's story continues to repeat itself over and over again, God having to prove time and time again that he is solidly and overwhelmingly capable of saving us out of our problems, if, just like Israel did, would only turn to him with all of our hearts, this story could be yours. Perhaps God, in the midst of proving his mercy and his love, through tribulation, plagues, suffering, only to bring about a time of prosperity and happiness. If you go back and read the end of that chapter, it says that they had 40 years of quietness after Gideon's victory. And they wanted to make him ruler, and he said, don't make me the ruler, let God be your ruler. It is a story, once again, of our rescue. And as Jeremiah said on one occasion, it is a time of Jacob's trouble, but God is going to deliver you out of